Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this new Hangout, ReactQuery Hangout with Daniel Linsley. He'll be talking about React Query and how to do fetch with hooks and in React. So, hi Tanner, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you?
Fine, fine. Thanks for being here. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, you
So,
bet.
yeah. So I will let Tanner present, and then you can ask some question during the talk, and we will read them afterwards. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. It helps us. Okay, so Tanner, you can go. You can start.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on here. I didn't know if you mentioned how long do we have, actually.
We have about 30 minutes, but
Perfect.
if you need more, that's okay.
Oh, no, I think that should be plenty.
Okay.
Yeah, so just really quick, I'm Tanner Linsley, and yeah, I built a library called ReactQuery. We're going to be talking about that today. And some of the, let's see, make sure you guys can see this really well here. That big enough? Okay, so React Query is a library that is supposed to help you fetch data and update asynchronous data in your React applications. And one of the biggest reasons that I built this is because it seems like everybody who's watching can probably relate to this, but you're either using use state or use reducer with an effect and probably fetch or Axios to go and fetch external data for your React apps. So either you're living in that camp where, let's see if I can show you now. I don't need to show you that. But you're either living in that camp where you're doing everything with just React hooks and use effect and fetch or whatnot, or you've got something like Redux, which you're managing reducers and thunks and maybe even sagas to fetch your asynchronous data. Or you might be in a camp like using Apollo or GraphQL. And there's challenges with every single one of these, especially when it comes to making decisions on, when do you cache those results? Is this local state or global state? Are you deduping requests across your app? So you're not making multiple requests for the same assets. And then even more questions come into play when you start thinking about things like dependent and conditional queries for data. Making optimistic updates. And then it gets really hairy when you get into things like pagination, infinite scrolling, and even talking about suspense. So I'm going to take you through kind of how React Query can solve a lot of those challenges and why it's going to make fetching data for you so much easier. So out of the gate, I have it installed, but the first thing you'll want to do is come and install React Query. It's just one library. I use Yarn, so I like to say yarn add React Query. And then from there, you can start importing the hooks from React Query to start using them. And instead of going through the docs, I just want to take you guys through some of these examples that I've coded up for you guys, just to make sure that you guys can see React Query as you'll be seeing it in your own code. So this here is an example. Let's see if we can hide this right here. You can see at the top here, I've imported Axios, which is just a fetching library. I like to use Axios instead of fetch, but you can use whatever you want. And that's the great thing too, is as long as it returns a promise, you can use it with React Query. And then you can import this use query hook from React Query, and we can start building some data queries. So inside of our app, we have kind of two components here. One that's going to show all of our posts, which we're rendering right here. And let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. And then when we have selected a specific post, we're going to show an individual post here. So right here, what you're seeing is this list of posts here. And I'm just grabbing these from a little placeholder API. But as we click on one of these, you'll see it go into the individual post view. And you might actually see a little bit of a loading. My internet's really fast, so the loading screen does not take very long to show there. I could actually introduce some artificial lag if we want. Let's do that really quick. Create new promise. Solve. Timeout. Resolve. Let's do 2 seconds of lag so you guys can really see that loading screen. So click into one of these posts here. We'll get 2 seconds of that loading, and then it will finally show the post. But you'll notice now that as we go back to the main post page, we don't wait for any of that data right there. And if we go back to any of these posts that we've already looked at, so I just hit the second one there and it loads. We go back and hit the second one again, you'll notice that it's instantaneous. But you'll also see right here, there's a background updating notification. And that's because ReactQuery, the first thing that it's doing for you is that it's caching all of your results out of the box and background updating them when you reuse them. So by using just one hook, use query, which looks like this, we'll look at the posts, the use query for the main post page. You just say use query, give it a name. I call this one post, and then you give it a function that's going to go return a promise with the results that you want. And that get post is just this little fetch function. It comes back and you get some information about that query, the status, which can be loading, error, or success. You get the data, and if there's an error, it will be in this error variable right here. And you also have this is fetching. Oh, let's see. Andrea Belli asked, the only thing I didn't quite like is that there's no is fetching selected from multiple queries, just a global one. You're right, and there is some work being done to help you get around that right now. But for now, yeah, you'll have to rely on the is fetching variable to know if a query is background fetching or not. So this is the one for the main posts, and you'll see you just have to handle these 3 cases where if you're doing a hard load, you want to show loading. And if you're showing an error, if you're in an error status, I don't know why, but my Siri keeps triggering. I don't know if you see that. If you're in an error status, then you want to show the error. Oh my goodness. And then if you're not in either of those, you're probably in a success state. Really, this is status equals success, but since it's the last ternary, you don't need to do that. And you can just assume that you have your data and map over it. And then I'm just setting the post ID when we click on one of these, and then the individual post. So when we go into one of these, it's the same exact thing. We're just saying use query, but here, instead of having an individual key, or you know what, guys, hold on a second. I'm going to disable Siri because she is popping up all the time right now. I don't know why. Jeez, Siri, take it easy. Okay, so for this individual post, you don't use an individual like post string. You can actually pass an array for the query key. And we do this conditionally because we don't want this query firing off unless we have a post ID. So as long as we have a post ID, we're going to return this array that says this is a post and here's the post ID. And under the hood, ReactQuery is going to turn that into a query key for you to keep track of the query result and cache it. And then we get that post ID just from the component right here in this example. So post ID is being sent through right here. And then that's so funny. Somebody said, not only Siri, you are triggering even Bixby on my TV. That is weird. I must have one of those voices. So this use query instance, it just uses the individual get post by ID. And this is actually the first one where you can see we get to use the parts of the query key that we pass in as arguments in our fetcher function. So here we would have the key, which this would be to do, or sorry, this would be post. But since we don't need that, we can just leave it blank, or we can just call it key. What we really care about is this post ID that we're sending through. And then we can pass that through to our fetcher to get the right post, and then just return the data. And that's all that's happening here in this post query. So it's the same thing. We have just loading and an error state. And then if we have the data, then we show. Let's see, I already fetched that one. So it was instant. Let's go down the list a little bit. There we go. So loading, and then we have our data. So we show the title body. And then we have this is fetching variable, and we can say, is it background fetching? And if it is, then we want to show that background fetching right here, background updating. So really, that's the most basic way to use ReactQuery. And just out of the box, you get so many things that you would have to write and worry about, and things that you wouldn't even get using other tools. Mainly, you just get really sane defaults for caching. You get query deduping. So if we were to use this get posts hook, or this get post query right here all over our app in a bunch of different places at the same time, we would still only be making one request, and it would still only be using one instance of that post request in that query. So you get deduping out of the box. It does really good at cache busting out of the box, so you don't need to worry if things are up to date. And then it just, after that, it comes with so many other little tools that help you expand the experience to be even better. So now that I hope this kind of laid the groundwork for how the library works in its most basic form. And now I want to take you through some examples on how you can take it even a step further. So just by using this most basic version of use query, you're already leaps and bounds ahead of what you would normally have if you were just using React State, or even Redux. If you're managing thunks and sagas and selectors, like, you don't need to write any of the reducers. You don't need to write selectors. And also you get a bunch of other things that you wouldn't get, like all those other cool things I said, conditional queries and optimistic updates and whatnot. So let's see, somebody had a question. Can you show how to make the loading show every time you click the same item, conditionally turn off caching? Yeah, that's interesting. I can show you how to do that. Use query comes with so many options. The documentation is extremely thorough for ReactQuery. So you can come in here. I've written kind of like this guide version that goes all through how to use ReactQuery kind of in this guide format. And then at the very end, there's a hard API reference that you can check out. But one of them is there is something called a stale time. And stale time takes an integer, which is milliseconds, that the cache data remains fresh. And after a successful cache update, the cache data will become stale after this duration. So if we go back to our basic example on our posts, if we were to add this option of stale time 5 seconds, notice that if we come back here and come back to the post, it won't refetch. But after 5 seconds, it's going to become stale, and it's going to want to refetch this entire post list. And you'll notice that it's actually not showing the loading, because we still have that request cached in our query cache, but it is refetching it every 5 seconds. So I wish we could pull up our we can pull up our network request here. I can show you exactly how it's working. Let's see. So let's reload this, and you'll see it request. Let's see. So if we come in here, you'll see the individual post request. And if we come back, you'll see it just requested posts. And that's because we passed the 5 second gap. If we go in and come back out, it did it again because we just passed up 5 seconds. So stale time is just saying how often do you want to be refetching your data in the background. Now, if we wanted to hit that hard loading state, we could do cache time, and this actually tells it to clear the cache. Every second, it's going to be clearing the cache. So you're actually going to be hitting hard data loading states. So if we come back here, after 1 second, this post list should actually, am I doing this right? Stale time 0. This would effectively disable all of the caching for a React query. And that actually might be a bug. But if you want to, I think it's because we're doing it on this main post list. If we were to do it on this smaller post right here, effectively setting the cache time and stale time both to 0, you would be Actually, no, I think I have it opposite. You want to keep your data stale for a really long time, and you don't want to cache your data ever. I wonder if we could get this to work right. So if we do that and come back, we'll have to play a little bit around with it like that. One of the main reasons is that getting that hard loading state is something that you never really want to give your users. If you have the data in your cache, you never really want to show them that hard loading state unless you've never fetched it before. But we'll actually see a little bit of that in the next stale time uppercase T. That might have been why it wasn't working. I have a lot more examples though, so I don't want to get too caught up on just this one use case. But moving on to the next example I wanted to show you guys is that you can easily take these same use query hooks that you're doing and put them into your own custom hooks. So this is that same example, but instead of using use query right inside of these components, we just hide it behind these use post and use posts hooks. And each of those hooks just looks like this. It has the fetcher function right next to the export, and then that's it. We can just blindly import use post and use posts, and it will work just the same way because it's just a custom hook. And that's really the pattern that I would suggest everybody use out of the gate, mostly just because having all these use queries all over the place in your components can get a little overwhelming sometimes. The next one that I want to show you guys is a case where it does auto refetching. And to do that, I'm going to have to spin up next. So we're going to cd into the auto refetching repo and run this example. The reason I do this is you need an API that you can control. And we could do this in Code Sandbox, but it just is kind of finicky sometimes. So this right here is a to-do list, and it's cool because we can add to-dos and they're refetched whenever we add a new to-do. And I'll show you this right here, auto refetching index. So we have a use query instance right here where we're pulling in to-dos for this app, and we're just getting it from our backend. But we have this refetch interval set to 1,000. So it's going to be refetching that endpoint every second that we're doing this. And you can't really see the effects if you just have one window. And that's why I think this is a better example on your local machine. But if we pull up another window, I can actually show you how that works. So both of these windows are polling at 1 second every single time. And if we enter in some more stuff, you'll see the other window is updating every second. Clear them all, it'll update there too. So it has polling built into it. And honestly, I don't really use polling that often, but if you have something like a message list or something that's always updating all the time, and you know it is, it has auto fetching built into it. So you can use polling, and that's pretty cool. I always think that's a pretty cool example to show. And it'll work across your server, essentially. The next example I wanted to show you, and really quick, so you know how to do that, that's just refetch interval. And we'll get into some of this mutation stuff here in a bit. I'd rather show you that with a different example. And then let's see, the next example I wanted to show you guys is optimistic updates. Oh, that's the example that I'm going to show you how to do mutations. So there's a lot of tools out there that, the optimistic index. There's a lot of tools out there that help you with asynchronous data and like fetching asynchronous data, but there's not a lot of them that take into account mutations. And mutations is really what throws throws a wrench in your queries, because you can cache your queries all you want, but anytime that you mutate anything on the server that has to do with one of those queries, you are going to have to refetch that query because something has potentially changed. So in this circumstance, we're adding items to this to-do list, and I'm sending them in lowercase, but the server is actually saving them in uppercase. And you can see that it's added to the list as lowercase immediately. And if the server saves it, it turns it to be uppercase. And I want to show you guys how that works. So we have a query right here to get our to-dos from the server. And it's just returning a promise of axios.get API data. And then we have this use mutation hook. Use mutation is really cool. So you pass it a function that you want to be able to run with your mutation. It can take variables and map them into anything that returns a promise. And then it gives you some really nice lifecycle hooks. So it gives you back this mutate post to do variable, which you can see is what we call when we submit this form. So we say whatever text is in here, submit it with that text, this mutate post to do. That's the function that gets returned by use mutation. But what's great is it comes with all these like little side effect life cycles. And we can say, hey, when this mutation is called on mutate, we're going to do a couple of things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to store the previous value from the query cache for the to-dos. And then we're going to optimistically add that new item onto the list, even before we've sent off the mutation to the server. And then we're going to return this previous value so that we can use it later in case it fails. So even before it goes out to the server, we're appending it to that list. And these are actually failures when it disappears. So when the server comes back and says, hey, it was a success, what we want to do is we want to remove that text that's in that box. So on success, we set text to nothing. So you can see that once I submit that, if it's successful, it will clear the box. And then if there's an error, what we're going to do is we're going to use that previous value that we snapshotted before we updated the query cache optimistically. We pass that previous value and it comes out and it's on error, and we can say, if there's an error, I want you to reset to what it was before. So you'll see that if we optimistically add something and there's an error, which we'll get every now and then. Come on. Try again. Oh my goodness. Maybe our error rate is too low. Come on. There we go. So I added Linsley, and it showed up there for a minute because we optimistically added it to our query cache before we sent it off to the server. But because there was an error, we used the previous value that we snapshotted here, and we reset the query data for all the to-dos back to that previous value because we know that something happened. And then regardless of what happens, whether it's an error or a success, there's this onSettled callback where we can actually tell our query cache to refetch any queries. In this case, we tell it to refetch the to-dos query. Anytime that there's an error or a success, we just tell it to refetch. And that's actually what's happening is we add an item, and when it is successful, we refetch the to-dos query in it, and that's what updates it to what the server actually saved it as, which is this uppercase version. So this tool right here, although it may look simple, like this is extremely valuable. Anytime that you're mutating anything, you want to be able to offer performance improvements to your users, like optimistically updating the UI before it actually goes to the server. And this API makes it extremely easy to do that. And then also handling errors and refetching queries when certain things happen. Like if we weren't doing this onSettled right here, we could add an item. And if it stayed successful, if we never refetched from the server, then it would just stay as our optimistic version. But you'll notice once I focus back onto the window, it triggers a refetch too. And that's something that's built into ReactQuery too. That anytime you refocus the window, any active queries on the page get refetched in the background to make sure that everything's always up to date. So this is extremely useful and fairly new. This on Mutate just came out last week. So be sure to check that out in the docs. You can ask me more questions about that later if you want. So yes, a question from Samto says, is there an on settled for use query? Yes, there's an on error, on success, and on settled for when you're using use query as well. So you can trigger side effects for use query instances as well. So very excellent question. Thank you. And then let's see, the next one I want to show you guys, these ones will go a little bit faster, is pagination. And I'm going to show that one to you in next as well. These ones will go really quick. Let's see, get that personal data off my screen. All right, so this pagination one is pretty fun. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Pagination is specifically interesting because usually when you're requesting new pages, you'll get a hard loading. So if you hit next page in most other libraries or tools, or even just building it yourself, you'll see a hard loading message and all these projects from the last page will disappear until the new ones come up. But when you use the pagination, when you use this hook called use paginated query, this is just a special version of use query. It's the exact same API except for a few things. You have the resolved data, which is the last known successful page, and the latest data, which is the most up-to-date version of the page. And what this does for you is it makes it so you can load the next page and still view the last page of data while you're loading the next one. And it also caches all of these individual pages. So if we were to go back between these pages, it's instantaneous, but you can see they're still refetching in the background to make sure that they're up to date. And you also have access to this latest data and resolved data so that you can let your component know, hey, don't allow the user to go to the next page unless we have specified that they're allowed to using the latest data and not the cached data. So use pagination or use paginated query is very powerful for keeping results from the last page around while you're loading new results. And then very similar is this example of a load infinite scroll scenario, and you can see that there's also a use infinite query, which is another version of use query. Very lightweight, these different versions. And similarly, it will help you keep track of old results, but instead of replacing them, you can tack onto them. So this infinite query, what it's doing is it's fetching more as you go down the screen. And I've set up an intersection observer on the submit button to fetch more results. So anytime that comes into the screen, we got to reload here. Anytime that comes into the screen, it's going to load more. So if we scroll to the bottom, it loads more. And you can see each one of those is cached independently. And when we come and unfocus the page and come back, you'll see the timestamps update because they're getting updated in the background. Again, very useful if you do any type of infinite scrolling or load more type of UI. And then the last few examples I wanted to show you are not local, but I can show them to you. The code sandbox that has this little playground in here, or somebody was asking, oh, what about stale time and cache time? Well, you can come into this playground and kind of tweak those values in real time and kind of see what happens. And to make it even better, there's a little DevTools symbol right here in the corner. So ReactQuery actually comes with its own DevTools. You can see I'm loading those right here. It's just a component that you render, and it gives you access to these DevTools right here. So you can see you get live feedback for how your queries are performing, if they're fresh, if they're stale, whether they're fetching or not. And you can also take a look at individual queries. You can explore their results in real time. You can look at the query cache itself to see, what's the state of this query and if it was suspended or canceled or anything. You can actually manually refetch it too, or just remove it entirely. So awesome dev tools built right alongside ReactQuery. This is another fun little example that, let's see, one of my good friends, Brent M. Clark, built this example, and it's just a ReactQuery version of the Star Wars API. So if we click on films, you'll see it loads up some films. And as we go around, you'll see that it becomes instantaneous. If we click on Darth Vader again, let's see, go back to films, Attack of the Clones. No, we want Return of the Jedi. Darth Vader should be in here somewhere. There he is. Click on Darth Vader, you see his stuff comes up immediately because we've already looked at him. So it's really nice. React queries, this is out of the box usage. He's not really doing anything super special. He's just setting up his queries for each character and all the characters in each film and all the films. And out of the box, it just kind of works really great. So the last example that I'd love to show you guys, but I don't think there's a whole lot of time, is a suspense example, but it's basically just the same thing that I've shown you, but it works with suspense. So, oh, cool. I can show you then. Let's see. Suspense. Actually, I haven't looked in this example in a while, so I hope it's still working correctly. So right here, this is it's going to suspend when I hit this button. So instead of going to the new page, showing a hard loading indicator, you're going to see a little spinner next to the show projects. And then when the query gets done, it just loads everything in, and it'll do the same thing. So if we hide the projects and bring it back, it will be instantaneous. But you'll see that it reloads in the background with that little loading spinner right there. Same thing if we click on one of these libraries, you'll see it suspend on this button and come into ReactQuery. If we go back and come back into ReactQuery, you'll see it load instantly, but background refresh. So it works really well with suspense, and it's especially going to work really well with the new version of React Router. You're going to be able to just basically put your prefetch for a query right on the route, so that when the route loads, it can start prefetching that data. And the way that works is you set up your query config. So there's a provider that ReactQuery gives you that you can just provide a default config to your entire app. And you just set suspense to true, and it takes care of a bunch of defaults for you. And then set up your error boundaries and your suspense boundaries. Make sure that you're showing fallbacks if you have to. And then in this example, I actually put the queries in their own file. And I'll show you why I did that. So the query functions themselves live in this file right here. And then in the components themselves, let's look at projects. The way that this works is, actually, no, let's go back to the index page. So if we were to just load projects immediately, it would suspend. But what we do is when we click on this button to show projects, we fire off a prefetch query. So ReactQuery's query cache export comes with a prefetch query method where it looks exactly like the function signature for use query. You just pass it the query key and the function to go get it. But we're just firing off an individual prefetch. And so that will actually kick off the query cache and the query before we even render use query at all. So when we get into the project component and it says use query projects, and we're passing it that same fetch projects function from the queries, by the time this gets here, it's already been fetching. This will suspend. You can see there's no use for status here anymore because we're using suspense or error for that matter. You can still use as fetching because you want to know if it's background refetching, but this will suspend if it's not ready. And then when it's ready, you can just use the data immediately. And it's the same thing for clicking onto a project. You say when you click on a project to load it, just prefetch that project and then set the active project on in your app, or navigate to wherever you want to go. And then the project will also suspend right here. And when it's ready, you get the data. So it works really well with suspense. And not only just works well with suspense, but works well with the fetch as you render suspense paradigm. So it's really neat. See, some questions. How does it know when to start dropping off the oldest data in the infinite list to prevent bogging down the size of the cache? Well, it won't drop off the oldest data in an infinite list. The whole point of an infinite list is to cache all of the data going forward. You can virtualize that, but really the default cache time for ReactQuery is 5 minutes for unused data. So if you had an infinite list like Pinterest and you scrolled down out of the view and you weren't using any of that data, I guess, for 5 minutes, it would disappear. But it would just refetch again as soon as you brought it into view. So ReactQuery doesn't come with any virtualization utilities. So you got to keep that in mind. It's just a data fetching utility, but it integrates well with things like React Window and whatnot. So the next question says, say I'm fetching 3 to-dos at a time, but each query needs different ordering. If I mutate the to-dos, can these 3 separate queries update? So that's a good question. And let's see, different ordering. So if you have 3 to-do lists and they're all being sorted separately and differently on the server, you probably aren't going to want to optimistically update those lists because you don't necessarily know what order that new to-do is going to be until you refetch those queries. So if that's the case and you have 3 separate queries pulling different to-dos from the server, if you mutate one of those to-dos, just do a refetch on all of those. And that's why you can use arrays for query keys, because you don't have to include the entire array query key. You can just refetch part of it. So for this individual query key, as an example, I wouldn't have to do, whoops, I can't edit this. Let me edit it. I wouldn't have to do refetch queries and pass in the entire query key, the exact one that I wanted to know. If I didn't know this active project, but I just knew that I wanted to refetch all of them, it does partial query matching. So you can actually just leave off the tail end of it and it will refetch anything that has project as the first item. So those are also really, really great utilities for refetching your queries. That was the last example I had. All of those examples in some form or another are on the README right here. You can look at the code sandbox or the source, and you can dig into how they work. Currently, ReactQuery that I know of it's already being integrated into a lot of teaching materials on Egghead. It's been mentioned along with other really sophisticated ones like Apollo and even Relay and other podcasts I've listened to. And I know also that it's already being adopted by big companies like Walmart and a handful of other ones that I don't really want to say, but I have analytics on that I know that they're using them. So yeah, like it's a really great library and I'm really proud of it. It makes my life a lot easier. I use it at nozzle.io, which is the SaaS product that I co-founded 6 or 7 years ago. So we use it to manage everything on our back end and make sure that everything's up to date. Another really cool thing that kind of fits in with the times, right, is somebody was able to point out to me this cool little Texas, this lovetexans.org is just a little proof of concept site that's talking about coronavirus, and it will tell you, how close the nearest case is to you and no matter what happens, it'll tell you to stay home, which you should. Everyone should. But yeah, this is using ReactQuery to gather all of the data from the API that they're using. So really cool.
Cool, thanks. You have time for other question? I see a couple of other questions on the chat.
Oh, I've got as much time as you want. So
TypeScript support.
Take up too much time. So
TypeScript support.
So let's see, TypeScript support. So it's not built with TypeScript, and it does not have native TypeScript types. I have left that to the community, and on the last 0.x version, they had types and they were up to date. And I believe the TypeScript junkies who love ReactQuery, they're currently updating the types to work with 1.0. I don't use TypeScript myself, so it's not a big pain point for me. And for a lot of other people that do use it and they just want to use it right now, I just tell them to ignore the types. I know that doesn't bode well for a lot of people that are like super into TypeScript.
Yeah.
But for now, that's what you're gonna have to do. It's unit tested really well. It's got really good code coverage. Like, if you're worrying about the types for safety, I wouldn't worry about it. If you want the types for just developer experience, then I would encourage you to just go contribute to the definitely typed repo, where the TypeScript community is working on them.
Do you think TypeScript?
If we pull up,
yeah,
definitely typed. Let's see if we can pull it up really quick.
Would you recommend against using TypeScript for writing libraries, or that's just a personal?
No, it's just really just a personal preference. If you're a TypeScript person and you write an open source library in TypeScript, that's great. Everybody gets types for free. But the other thing too is that non-TypeScript people will have a much harder time contributing to your library. And there's just a lot of just trade-offs, just pros and cons. And for me personally, where I'm working mostly just me and maybe a handful of other people working on these libraries that I build, I personally don't use TypeScript yet, so it's just a personal decision. And I don't want this to become a screencast about TypeScript, but
yeah, sure.
I have my own opinions, and I've talked about it way too much on Twitter. Sometimes it just becomes unproductive, but yeah, I think TypeScript is great, and if you want to use it and contribute to the types, then I think more power to you. So,
and there's another question.
Let's see. In some cases, passing in a variable to use query, you use key variable and key variable. Why? And which should we stick to? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. For anyone not following the chat, they're talking about the difference. Let's see. Talking about the difference here, where in this individual post query, it's actually not used for this example, but this individual post query, you're passing in post and then the post ID. And he says that sometimes he's seen this format. And this format is actually just kind of a breadcrumb from pre 1.0 use query or React query. This still works, and this is just fine. Everything will get serialized just the same under the hood. So you really don't need to worry about it. I don't use this unless I need to pass through multiple parallel. If I was a good example of this, if I was doing like posts, actually, let's do that up top. So in this posts query right here, if I wanted to get a specific version of posts where it was like, I wanted like posts that were done and posts that were updated after, some timestamp. Then this is a situation where like you wouldn't want to put those like this. Like if you did done and then new date like this, that as a query key doesn't make much sense. You know what I mean? So where you need to pass like parallel options for your queries, I think this does still make sense, and you can still do this. Everything will get sorted and serialized just fine. You don't need to worry about it. But in situations where you're just passing through like one variable, most of everybody's queries for this type of stuff is just hierarchical. So you're like, hey, here's a post ID. You don't need to bother passing in an object, but you can. You can actually pass in like as many of these as you want, as many query key strings as you want to make it as specific or as general as you want. So yeah, query keys are very flexible. Just use whichever one makes the most sense for you. The other cool thing too, if you do go with something like this over this one, in the dev tools, you'll get to see post ID on the query key. Whereas with this one, you would just see post, comma, and then the post ID. So that answers your question. You can stick to whatever one you want.
Yep. Yes, thanks. So you're also the author of React Table, React Form, and React Charts, and they are also great libraries, so everyone should check them out. And they also all have in common that they are very lightweight. So compared to equivalent libraries, do you have any tips for the rest of us on how to keep our libraries lightweight?
Yeah, don't import.
What's your secret?
Don't import external libraries. If you look at the dependencies for React Query, there's one, and that's just for analytics. It doesn't even get imported into the library. So the only thing it depends on is React, which is just a pure dependency. That's how you keep them lightweight.
Does it require more work, or?
Sometimes you'll end up with like a utilities file. Sometimes like here's React Queries utilities file, and you'll see some things in here like here's a no op function, and use get latest a hook I use in a few places. Is object deep includes is online. So you'll end up with a few little utilities, but most of the time it's just not worth importing external libraries. Like I could have imported Lodash instead of these, but by not doing that, I'm saving myself a ton of overhead. So
nice.
Well, I got some new questions here. I'm kind of new to React, so you can fetch data, cache it, and store it in component state using hooks, and using your library. So in some way, this can replace Redux for state management. Absolutely. Not all of it, but most of it. I wanted to point you guys at this talk I did. So let's see if I can get back to, here we go. So, you guys don't want to see that. You guys want to go to the YouTube one. If you just go to JSConf Hawaii, you got to go to their YouTube. Here we go. Or you can just go to my Twitter. I've shared it today. But there is a video, a talk that I did just a month ago on this exact subject. So in this talk, I go through using hooks for abstracting state and abstracting a bunch of stuff using just React hooks. And one of those, like from basically from the halfway mark forward, all I do is talk about state. And in my experience, I was able to reduce basically 90% of my global state down to just caching server state. So after I moved all my stuff over to React Query, I was really only left with a few little global state things. And it didn't even make sense to keep them in Redux anymore. So in that video, I go through and talk about how to create like creating a global store like this and how to pass it down through your entire app. But I mean, once you start using React Query, you'll notice that there's really not a lot of global state. Most of the global state people think about it as like sharing data. So React Query takes care of all that. You don't need to worry about it after that. That's one of the biggest advantages to moving to React Query is you have like 10% of the global state you normally did before. And you can still use Redux for that global state if you want. There's no reason you have to move away from it. So another question, if you're only using Redux for caching API data, you wouldn't need Redux. That's true. Thanks, Pete. And cross-component data sharing. Yeah, so that's the other cool thing is ReactQuery doesn't store data in the component that you use it in. It stores it outside in a global cache. So you don't need to worry about where you use queries in your app. They're always just going to be shared and using as little footprint as they possibly can. Pete says, if data comes from an API, use ReactQuery. If the data only exists on client, maybe stick with Redux or context. Boom, Pete, you nailed it. That's great. Pete, you should go watch my talk. You'll probably love it.
Okay. I think we don't have any more questions.
Yeah.
Are there any features you would like to add to ReactQuery in the future?
Well, we've talked about it. So the mutation stuff is really nice that we've been working on, and mutations keep getting some nice little API bumps here and there, like this optimistic mutation API is fairly new, but I don't foresee a ton of amazing things to come into ReactQuery. But what I do see is there might be some more usability improvements around using ReactQuery with things like GraphQL, or even creating higher level libraries that use ReactQuery under the hood to make all of this even easier. Like, for instance, this is all theoretical, but if you had a schema, of how your data was related and laid out, and you were able to, you could take that schema technically and turn it into just kind of a bunch of automatic hooks that use ReactQuery under the hood. I've heard some people talking about doing that. It could be brittle, so I don't know. It's kind of theoretical. So that's one idea. And there's a lot of people that I'm talking to that are, for better or worse, I don't know yet, but they're moving away from Apollo and just using ReactQuery with like a GraphQL fetcher under the hood. There's some things that I don't have in ReactQuery that Apollo has, just because it's not built for GraphQL specifically. But for the 80 to 90% use case, I think a lot of those things are just not as important as people think, and that's why I'm seeing so many people just start to use a GraphQL fetcher with ReactQuery. Those are just some things I've seen in the community. I myself have plans to just keep it up to date, keep it polished, especially when Suspense comes out for reals. We'll probably see a few little minor changes around how Suspense works. So,
okay.
Suspense for data fetching, at least.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tanner. It was great. Is there anything else you would like to say, or?
No, I don't think so. Unless anybody else has any more questions. I'm going to be giving a talk on ReactQuery at the replacement conference that React Summit is doing in this next month in April. They delayed their conference to September, and they've asked me to speak. I'm not exactly sure on the details, but I'll be talking more or less about ReactQuery here in a month. So look out for that, and just make sure to go and hit me up on Twitter and YouTube. And and if any of you guys use ReactQuery at your companies or places of work, then hit up your bosses to sponsor me on GitHub. That's been one of the main reasons that I've been able to build all these libraries and help people out, is because I have really awesome contributors and sponsors that even the littlest bit has helped me out a ton. So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And so don't hesitate to sponsor Tanner if you use his library, and subscribe to the channel so we can get more content for you. And well, stay healthy, everyone.
See ya.
See you. Bye.